Hate thrives in the shadows, feeding on fear and silence. But one quiet morning in a suburban park, that darkness collided with a force it couldn't comprehend. What began as a group of racists targeting a black man and his dog turned into the unraveling of a network built on terror. The gang assumed their numbers and cruelty would be enough. They were wrong. Hunter Pierce was no ordinary man. A retired Army sniper, he carried with him years of training, an unshakable resolve, and a loyalty forged with his fiercely intelligent shepherd, Shadow. The gang saw only a solitary figure, someone they believed they could bully into submission. But their attempt at domination would spark a chain of events that would dismantle their operations and expose the system protecting them. This isn't just a story about one man's skills in combat or the loyalty of his companion. It's about a quiet but unstoppable force standing against hatred, a community finding its courage, and the justice that comes when fear meets its match. By the time the dust settled, those who thought they could intimidate their way to power would find themselves brought to their knees. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe. The suburban park was alive with the sounds of morning serenity. Children's laughter echoed from the playground, mingling with the rhythmic hum of joggers' footfalls and the melodic bird song that floated through the crisp air. Sunlight filtered through the trees, dappling the winding paths with patches of golden light and shadow. Hunter Pierce walked steadily along the trail, Shadow at his side. The German shepherd moved with a calm confidence, his ears alert but not tense, his sleek coat shimmering under the sun's rays. His nose twitched with interest at every passing scent. A squirrel's recent dash, the earthy musk of damp leaves, and the lingering traces of picnics from the day before. For Hunter, these morning walks were more than a routine. They were a sanctuary. In a world that often teetered on the edge of chaos, this hour offered a reprieve, a chance to clear his mind and feel connected to something beyond himself. He relished the simplicity of it all, the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, the warm leather leash in his hand, and the steady companionship of Shadow. As they rounded a gentle curve in the trail, Hunter noticed a group of men gathered by a bench under a sprawling oak. They lounged in the shade, their laughter harsh and discordant against the otherwise tranquil backdrop. One of them, a stocky man with a leather jacket slung lazily over his shoulders, gestured toward Hunter and leaned in to murmur something to his companions. Whatever he said elicited sharp, mocking laughter that sliced through the air like a jagged edge. Hunter's steps remained measured, his expression carefully neutral, though he could feel the weight of their gazes trailing him. Their voices dropped into hushed whispers, punctuated by bursts of sneering laughter. Shadow's ears twitched, his sharp instincts sensing the tension, but a quiet command from Hunter kept him steady at his side. This wasn't the first time Hunter had encountered hostility like this, and he knew better than to engage. "Hey!" The stocky man's voice rang out, loud and grating, cutting through the distance between them. "I'm talking to you!" Hunter slowed to a stop as the man stepped onto the trail, blocking his path. "You deaf or something?" the man added with a smirk, his tone dripping with derision. Hunter met his gaze, his expression calm yet unyielding. "Morning," he said evenly, his voice steady, betraying no hint of unease. The man sneered, his lips curling into something that resembled a smile, but felt far more menacing. "Yeah, real nice morning," he drawled, his tone mocking. "But see, this here's our park. You're a little out of place, don't you think?" The words hung in the air, laced with a quiet threat. Shadow shifted slightly, his muscles taut, as if anticipating Hunter's next move. One of the others, a wiry man with tattoos climbing up his neck like ivy, rose from the bench and spat on the ground. His movements were deliberate, intended to draw attention. "He doesn't look like he's lost, does he? Maybe he's just stupid." His voice carried a sneer, each word sharp enough to cut. The group closed ranks slightly, their movements subtle but intentional, tightening the invisible noose around Hunter. Their laughter carried a note of menace, a dissonance that clashed with the morning's peace. The air seemed heavier now, tinged with the acrid scent of hostility. You think you can just stroll through here like you own the place? The leader said, stepping closer. His leather jacket creaked faintly as he moved, the weight of the chain in his hand glinting in the sunlight. People like you don't belong here. Never have, never will. Hunter remained still, his posture calm but alert, like a coiled spring. His gaze met the man's without wavering. I don't want any trouble, he said, his voice measured and firm. Just out for a walk. The leader chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. Oh, you don't want trouble? He mocked, his tone dripping with derision. Too bad, because it looks like you just found some. Beside him, Shadow let out a low, warning growl. The sound was quiet, but carried an unmistakable edge, a primal warning that sent a ripple through the tension. Hunter gently tapped Shadow's side, a silent command to hold steady. His heart thudded in his chest, but his face betrayed nothing. The leader smirked, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the length of a heavy chain. He let it dangle menacingly, its links clinking softly with an ominous rhythm. See, this is our turf. You either turn around now or, well, maybe we teach you a lesson you won't forget. The wiry man grinned and produced a small pocket knife, flicking it open with a flourish. Its blade glinted in the sunlight, a stark contrast to the park's serene backdrop. Better yet, he said with a twisted smile. Maybe we teach your mutt a lesson too. Hunter's jaw tightened, his grip on Shadow's leash firm. His mind raced, assessing the situation with practiced precision. You don't want to do this, he said quietly, his voice calm but laced with steel. His words were a warning, not a plea, carrying a weight that made the men hesitate, if only for a moment. The leader tilted his head, studying Hunter as if weighing the risk against the reward. Oh, I think we do, he said, stepping forward, the chain swinging slightly in his hand. The park seemed to hold its breath, the once cheerful sounds of morning now distant, muffled by the tension crackling in the air. Shadow tensed, his eyes locked on the group, ready to act at a moment's notice. Hunter stood his ground, a storm of determination brewing behind his calm exterior. The men only laughed, their circle tightening as they loomed closer. Their sneers grew sharper, their postures bolder, feeding off one another's hostility. Hunter knew the moment for words was slipping away, but he held his ground, his mind calculating every move, every escape route. Their taunts grew louder, the venom in their voices sharp and deliberate, aimed to provoke. You've got guts, the leader said, letting the chain in his hand dangle with deliberate menace, its metallic clinking adding to the growing tension. But you've got no clue who you're dealing with. You think you can just stroll through our park? Like it's nothing? Like you belong here? Hunter's eyes didn't waver. He tilted his head slightly, his expression neutral but unyielding. I wasn't aware parks had owners, he replied evenly. You got a deed for this place I didn't see? The leader's scowl deepened, his expression twisting into something uglier. Don't get smart with me, old man, he snapped, his voice dripping with contempt. People like you're the reason everything's falling apart. You come in, take what's ours, act like you're better than us. Hunter's gaze sharpened, his stance remaining steady. People like me, he repeated, his tone still calm but laced with an edge. What exactly does that mean? Go ahead. Spell it out. The wiry man with the tattoos stepped forward, his movements deliberate as he spat on the ground near Hunter's boots. His lips curled into a sneer. You know damn well what he means, he said, his voice low and filled with disdain. You don't belong here. You people think you can move in, push us out, and then what? Take everything? Shadow's growl deepened, vibrating like a low rumble of thunder. The dog's stance mirrored Hunter's, a quiet but unmistakable warning that they were prepared, no matter the odds. Hunter's fingers flexed slightly on the leash, his body taut with restrained energy. He didn't respond immediately, letting the weight of the wiry man's words hang in the charged air between them. The moment stretched, the world narrowing to just the six of them, the tension growing thicker with every breath. Hunter's brow furrowed slightly, but his voice remained calm. Everything? What exactly do you think I'm taking? A walk through the park? A patch of grass you haven't touched since last summer? Don't act dumb, the wiry man snapped, his voice sharp with anger. You move into our neighborhoods. Your kids take over our schools. Before long, we're the ones who have to leave, and you're the ones living easy. The leader sneered, stepping closer, the chain in his hand swinging lazily but purposefully. Yeah. And then you call us the problem. But we're not the ones who can't keep to our own side of the fence. Hunter's jaw tightened, though his face betrayed little else. And who built the fence? He asked, his voice steady but cutting. Who decided there even needed to be a side? You? Your father? Some guy who told you the world owes you everything as long as you can keep everyone else out? For a brief moment, the leader's smirk faltered. His eyes flickered with something, uncertainty, maybe even shame, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. He recovered with a sneer. Don't turn this around on me. You don't know anything about us. Then tell me, Hunter said, his tone hardening. What's so terrifying about someone walking through a park? Is it me you hate? Or are you just so scared of losing something you never earned in the first place? The wiry man bristled, his hand gripping the knife tighter, his knuckles whitening with the strain. You've got a big mouth for someone outnumbered 6-1. Hunter's eyes flicked to the knife, noting the trembling in the wiry man's hand before returning his gaze to his face. I've faced worse odds, believe me. The leader chuckled, though the sound was cold and hollow. Oh, you're one of those, huh? Think you're tough. Think you've got it all figured out. Let me tell you something. We've been here since the beginning. This is our town, our park, our rules. You think you can just come in here and act like you're one of us? You're nothing. Hunter took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes boring into the leader's, his voice lowering but gaining a quiet intensity that made even the leader hesitate. You keep saying our, like you own the air, the dirt, the trees, but you don't. You're just scared kids trying to hold on to something that was never yours to begin with, the wiry man snarled, his composure slipping further. Shut up! You don't know a damn thing about us. Hunter's gaze locked on him, unflinching and steady. His voice dropped to a razor's edge, calm but commanding. I know you're not half as tough as you want me to think. That's why there's 6 of you and 1 of me. That's why you need a chain and a knife, and I just need my dog. Shadow let out a low, steady growl, his eyes trained on the wiry man. The growl wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made the gang hesitate. Hunter stood firm, the leash slack but ready in his hand, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the simmering chaos in the air. The tension hung heavy, unspoken challenges passing between them like sparks, each side waiting to see who would make the first move. The leader's face darkened, his grip tightening on the chain until the metal links groaned under the strain. You really don't know when to shut up, do you? His voice was low and venomous, each word dripping with hostility. Hunter's voice dropped to match, calm yet razor-sharp. I know when to speak. I know when to act. And I know when to warn people before they make a mistake they'll regret. Shadow let out another low growl, the sound rippling through the tense air like distant thunder. The gang exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado flickering, if only for a moment. But the leader stepped forward again, anger flaring in his eyes, unwilling to let his authority waver. His movements were sharp, deliberate, each step an attempt to reassert control. You think you can scare us? The leader spat, his voice rising. We've dealt with plenty of guys like you. You're nothing special. Hunter's gaze held steady, unflinching. I don't need to scare you. You're already scared. That's why you're here, trying so hard to prove something to yourselves. But you're about to cross a line you can't walk back from. The leader's face twisted into a sneer, his anger bubbling over. You don't get to tell us what to do. Boys, let's show him what happens when someone steps out of line. The gang moved as one, their circle tightening until the space between them and Hunter was suffocating. The tension was palpable, crackling like a live wire ready to snap. Shadow's growl deepened, his entire body coiled like a spring, his sharp eyes darting between the advancing men. Hunter remained motionless, his focus trained on the leader, his instincts sharpening as he braced for the inevitable. Without warning, the leader lashed out, the chain slicing through the air with a sharp whistle. Hunter raised his forearm just in time to block, the metal striking his skin with a sting that sent a jolt of pain shooting through his arm. The force of the blow knocked him back a step, but he didn't falter. Before he could fully recover, the wiry man lunged at him, the glint of a knife flashing in the sunlight. His movements were wild but fast, driven by adrenaline and desperation. Hunter pivoted, narrowly avoiding the blade, and grabbed the man's wrist in one fluid motion. With a sharp twist, he forced the knife free, the weapon clattering to the ground with a dull thud. But the victory was short-lived. As he turned, the hulking man charged at him like a freight train, all brute strength and no finesse. Hunter barely had time to brace before the impact drove him to the ground. The force knocked the air from his lungs as he hit the dirt, the hulking man pinning him down with his weight. A triumphant sneer spread across the man's face, his breath hot and labored, his victory seeming assured as the gang closed in tighter. "You're done now!" the hulking man growled, his voice a guttural snarl as he raised his massive fist to strike. His weight pinned Hunter to the ground, his shadow looming like a thundercloud. Another attacker, wielding a rusted metal pipe, moved in with grim determination. Behind him, the wiry man scrambled frantically to recover his knife from where it had fallen moments before. Shadow barked furiously, the sharp staccato sound echoing through the park like a war drum. The dog darted around the group, his movements quick and purposeful, but one of the gang members swung wildly at him with a stick, keeping him at bay. Pinned beneath the hulking man's weight, Hunter gritted his teeth, his mind racing even as the odds stacked higher against him. Years of training surged to the forefront of his thoughts, screaming for calm and clarity. He couldn't overpower them in sheer strength. It wasn't a fight he could win head-on. He needed to be smarter, to use their aggression and overconfidence against them. "Shadow!" Hunter gasped, his voice sharp and commanding. "Circle!" At the word, Shadow instantly veered wide, darting in a fast, deliberate arc. The man with the metal pipe turned his attention to the dog, his focus splintering for just a moment. That moment was all Hunter needed. Hunter shifted his weight, using the hulking man's size against him. With a sudden, powerful buck of his hips, he threw the man off balance, just enough to create a sliver of space. With his free hand, Hunter grabbed a fistful of dirt from the ground and flung it into the man's face. The hulking man roared in pain, clutching at his eyes as he reeled back. Seizing the opportunity, Hunter rolled out from under him and sprang to his feet. His breaths came quick, but his movements were sharp, deliberate. The wiry man charged again, knife flashing as he slashed wildly, rage overtaking any sense of precision. Hunter sidestepped the attack, grabbed the man's arm, and twisted hard. The knife slipped from his grasp, clattering to the ground. Without hesitation, Hunter drove his knee into the wiry man's stomach, doubling him over and sending him sprawling to the dirt. The leader's chain lashed out again, this time wrapping tightly around Hunter's shin. The sudden yank pulled him off balance, and he dropped to one knee. The leader advanced, rage etched into his face. "You're not getting out of this," the leader snarled, raising the chain for another strike. Hunter didn't panic. His gaze flicked to the knife lying nearby, the one he'd forced from the wiry man's hand earlier. In a swift motion, he reached for it and caught it just in time. As the chain came down, Hunter deflected it with the knife's hilt and yanked hard, pulling the leader forward. Hunter surged upward, driving his shoulder into the leader's chest with unrelenting force. The impact sent the leader stumbling backward, his footing lost and his momentum broken. "You should have walked away," Hunter said, his voice cold and steady as he stepped forward, deliberate and unyielding. The man with the pipe, seeing Hunter regain ground, let out a guttural roar and charged recklessly. Hunter waited, his stance steady and calm, his body coiled like a spring. At the last possible second, he stepped aside, his movements deliberate and precise. Using the man's own momentum against him, Hunter caught the attacker's arm, twisted sharply, and wrenched the pipe free. With a fluid motion, he flipped the man onto his back, sending him crashing to the ground. The pipe clattered against the dirt with a metallic clang, a hollow echo of the man's groans of pain. Shadow, alert and relentless, circled back and targeted the hulking man, who was still wiping dirt from his eyes, cursing under his breath. With a powerful leap, Shadow clamped his jaws onto the man's arm, dragging him down with the force of his attack. The hulking man howled in pain, thrashing wildly as he tried in vain to shake the dog off. "Get this damn dog off me!" he bellowed, his voice raw with desperation. "Shadow, release!" Hunter barked, his tone commanding and sharp. Shadow immediately obeyed, releasing his grip and retreating to his master's side, his growl low and menacing. The hulking man cradled his bleeding arm, his bravado all but gone as he staggered on the ground. The leader, now clutching his ribs and panting heavily, scanned the scene with a growing sense of panic. His once confident smirk had been replaced by a grimace of pain and disbelief. Two of his men had already begun retreating, dragging the wiry man, still doubled over and gasping, away from the fray. "Don't run, you cowards!" the leader barked, his voice cracking under the weight of his rage. But the fleeing men didn't stop. Their fear outweighing their loyalty, Hunter stepped forward, his posture strong and unyielding, his piercing gaze fixed on the leader. "You thought 6-on-1 would make this easy," he said, his voice calm but cutting. "Guess you didn't count on needing 6 more." The leader spat blood onto the ground, his hand tightening around the chain as though it could somehow restore his control over the crumbling situation. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he snarled, his voice laced with bitterness. "You're just a dead man walking." "No," Hunter replied, his voice steady and cold. He took another step forward, closing the space between them. "I'm the reason you're walking away now instead of crawling." The hulking man, still clutching his injured arm and reeling from the pain, stumbled to his feet. His movements were slow and labored, his confidence shattered. "Boss, let's go," he muttered, his voice quiet and shaky. The remaining men glanced nervously between Hunter and the leader, their expressions a mix of fear, exhaustion, and defeat. "This isn't over. You don't know who you're dealing with," the leader hissed, his voice dripping with venom. His glare burned into Hunter, his chest heaving with frustration and defeat. Pointing a shaking finger at him, he spat out a final warning. "You'll regret this." Hunter's reply was calm but carried a lethal edge. "Not as much as you will." Shadow barked sharply, his teeth bared, and the leader flinched involuntarily, his tough demeanor faltering for a split second. Finally, the leader turned away, dragging the chain behind him with a hollow clinking sound. He followed the rest of his gang, who were already retreating down the trail. Their footsteps grew fainter and fainter until the sound melted into the ambient rustling of the park, leaving Hunter and Shadow alone in the clearing. Hunter exhaled slowly, the tension in his body easing slightly as he surveyed the aftermath. His hand rested on Shadow's head, the contact grounding him. "Good work, buddy," he murmured. Shadow licked his hand in response, his tail wagging faintly, though his posture remained alert, his ears perked and swiveling toward every distant noise. The park was eerily still now, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Scattered across the dirt path were the remnants of the confrontation: an abandoned pipe, a torn jacket, faint streaks of blood where the fight had played out. Hunter stood amidst the chaos, his chest rising and falling as he processed what had just happened. Shadow sat close by, his gaze fixed on the direction the gang had fled, his body still coiled like a spring, ready to act. Hunter winced as he felt the ache in his ribs and the sting in his forearm where the chain had struck him. The dull throb in his muscles reminded him of the physical toll the fight had taken, but he pushed the pain aside. There was no time to linger. He crouched near the spot where one of the attackers had dropped his backpack during the scuffle. It was old and battered, the fabric stained and frayed at the edges, the zipper partially undone as if it had been hastily abandoned. Hunter's eyes narrowed as he remembered the wiry man with the knife, the flash of fear in his eyes before he'd bolted, leaving everything behind. Hunter hesitated for a moment, scanning the surrounding area to ensure the gang hadn't circled back. Shadow let out a soft growl, his ears twitching, as if sharing his master's unease. Satisfied they were alone, Hunter pulled the backpack toward him, his movements deliberate. Whatever was inside, it might provide answers, or lead to more questions. Inside, Hunter found a tangled mess of items that told a chilling story. Crumpled papers, a cheap burner phone, and several cans of spray paint rattling at the bottom of the bag. He pulled out the phone first, flipping it open. Its screen was cracked, spiderwebbed with fractures, but it powered on. The lock screen displayed a flurry of missed messages, all from unknown numbers. Hunter scrolled through the texts, his brow furrowing as he read, "Next target confirmed. Same time tomorrow. Keep it quiet this time. Don't need cops sniffing around. Make sure the families know they aren't welcome." His grip on the phone tightened, the plastic creaking under the pressure of his hand. He didn't need to read further to grasp the scope of what he was dealing with. This wasn't a random act of violence born of boredom or anger. It was calculated, deliberate. A campaign of intimidation aimed at driving people out. Setting the phone aside, Hunter rifled through the papers next. Most were crude flyers scrawled with hateful slogans and symbols meant to incite fear, the kind of propaganda designed to cow and isolate communities. But one sheet stood out, a hand-drawn map of the park and surrounding neighborhoods. Red ink circled several houses, each marked with scribbled notes. Late-night delivery. New family. Warn them. Hunter's chest tightened as he studied the map. He recognized some of the addresses. Families who had recently moved into the area. Fresh starts etched onto their doorways. Families like his once had been, chasing hope and safety in a new place. Shadow whined softly beside him, nudging Hunter's arm with his wet nose. The dog's gaze was steady, almost questioning. "It's worse than I thought," Hunter murmured, rubbing Shadow's head absent-mindedly. "This isn't just a gang looking for trouble. They're trying to terrorize people. Push them out." Hunter rose to his feet, his eyes narrowing as they swept the horizon where the gang had vanished. The aches in his ribs and arm throbbed in time with his pulse, but he pushed the pain aside. It was unimportant. What mattered was stopping this, not just for those circled on the map, but for everyone who thought they could find peace here. He pocketed the phone and folded the map carefully before slipping it into the backpack. The weight of the evidence wasn't just physical. It pressed on him, a heavy reminder of the responsibility he now carried. These men weren't acting alone. They had a network, a plan, and the boldness to think they couldn't be stopped. But they hadn't planned for someone like him. As Hunter reached the edge of the trailhead, his car came into view, parked in the shadow of a tall oak. The setting sun cast long shadows across the dirt path. The once serene park now tinged with unease. He opened the car door, and Shadow hopped into the passenger seat, his tail brushing against the gear shift, his eyes fixed on Hunter, waiting for the next move. Hunter slid into the driver's seat, the map and phone resting on the console beside him. His mind churned with possibilities, a fire burning in his chest. The gang's threats, their plans, their confidence. It all boiled down to a simple belief. No one would stand up to them. They were wrong. Hunter sat behind the wheel, staring down at the phone in his hand. He scrolled through the messages again, reading each one more carefully, noting the timestamps and the patterns in the communication. It became increasingly clear that this wasn't a disorganized group of thugs. They operated in cells, coordinating across multiple areas. This wasn't just a local problem. It was bigger than he'd initially thought. A network built on fear and violence. His mind replayed the leader's parting words. "This isn't over. You don't know who you're dealing with." At the time, the words had sounded like desperate bravado, an attempt to salvage some control as they retreated. But now, as Hunter pieced together the gang's intent, Those words carried a heavier meaning. These men were confident for a reason. They believed they were untouchable, their actions invisible in the shadows. Hunter's jaw tightened, his grip on the phone hardening. They were wrong. They'd crossed a line, and now they'd face the consequences. He placed the phone on the dashboard and reached for the map, unfolding it with care. The red circles and scribbled notes seemed to pulse under the dim cabin light, each mark representing a family or home now steeped in danger. Hunter's eyes lingered on the notes. New family, warn them, late-night delivery. These weren't just scare tactics. They were calculated moves designed to intimidate and drive people out. Time to make them regret it, Hunter muttered, his voice steady, the calm before a storm. He glanced at Shadow, whose head tilted slightly as if he understood the weight of those words. The dog's presence was grounding, his loyalty unwavering. Hunter shifted the car into drive, his eyes fixed on the empty street ahead. The engine rumbled softly as he pulled onto the quiet road. The suburban neighborhood bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. This was bigger than him. This was about the families marked on that map, the people too scared to speak out, and anyone else who had suffered in silence. As the car rolled forward, Hunter's determination solidified. He didn't know exactly how deep this would go or how far the network extended, but he was ready. These men had started this fight, and now it was his turn to finish it. The hum of the engine filled the quiet cabin, a steady sound that mirrored his focus. Shadow sat calmly in the passenger seat, his ears twitching with every passing noise. Occasionally, he turned to glance at Hunter, as if sensing the storm beneath his composed exterior. Hunter's knuckles whitened around the steering wheel, his mind replaying the fight in the park. Every swing, every taunt, every hateful word hung heavy in his thoughts. He had defended himself, but the encounter had left a bitter taste. The evidence he'd uncovered gnawed at him. The map, the messages, the deliberate targeting of innocent families. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was methodical, intentional, and designed to sow fear. But fear worked both ways. They thought they could terrorize and walk away unchallenged. They hadn't counted on him. Yet, the weight of what came next pressed heavily on Hunter. He had seen enough in his years as an army sniper to know the difference between justice and vengeance. Justice was measured, deliberate, and served with restraint. Vengeance, on the other hand, was a wildfire, chaotic, driven by anger and pain, and often consuming those who pursued it. He had watched others fall into that spiral, and he had sworn to himself that he wouldn't follow the same path. A soft whine from Shadow broke through Hunter's thoughts. The German shepherd's head tilted, his sharp eyes fixed on his master with a look of quiet understanding. His tail wagged faintly, as if offering reassurance. "I know, boy," Hunter muttered, his voice low and steady. "This isn't just about me. It's about them, the families they're targeting, the ones they've already hurt." He let out a long breath, the tension in his chest easing slightly. Shadow leaned forward, resting his head on Hunter's arm, a grounding gesture that brought a small, fleeting sense of calm. The car rolled into the driveway, and Hunter turned off the engine. The silence that followed felt heavier than usual. His small house sat at the edge of a quiet cul-de-sac, surrounded by tall, swaying trees. This place had always been his refuge, a sanctuary away from the noise and chaos of the world. But tonight, the stillness only reminded him of the storm brewing inside him. Inside, Hunter methodically spread the evidence across his kitchen table. The battered map, the phone with its incriminating messages, and the hateful flyers. The crude slogans scrawled across the papers made his stomach twist with disgust. But his attention was drawn to the map, the red circles around houses, the scribbled notes marking them as targets. It all pointed to a coordinated effort to sow fear and division. Hunter stared at it for a long time, his mind turning over the possibilities. The soldier in him wanted to strike swiftly, dismantling the operation before it could escalate further. But the man who had left the military in search of peace hesitated. He knew the risks of going down this path. It wasn't just his life on the line. If he became a target, the people he cared about could be dragged into the crossfire. A nudge at his leg pulled him from his thoughts. Shadow, ever vigilant, pressed his head against Hunter's knee, his quiet presence a reminder of stability in the chaos. Hunter crouched down, running his hand over the dog's head, feeling the warmth and loyalty radiating from him. "You keep me grounded, don't you?" Hunter said softly. His voice carried a note of gratitude. "You remind me why I'm doing this. Not for revenge. Never for that. To stop them from doing it again. To protect the ones they think they can hurt." Shadow wagged his tail, leaning into Hunter's touch. The warmth and trust in the dog's presence calmed the storm in Hunter's chest, easing the tension knotting his muscles. For a brief moment, clarity returned. He'd act, but it would be on his terms. With precision, not rage. Justice, not vengeance. His choices would be calculated and deliberate, ensuring that no one else would have to endure what these men were trying to inflict. Meanwhile, across town, Daryl Kane sat in his dimly lit office, his expression carved from stone. His fingers drummed impatiently on the arm of his leather chair, the rhythmic tapping the only sound in the otherwise silent room. The flickering light from a cheap desk lamp cast jagged shadows on the walls, highlighting the hard lines of his face. Daryl was a man who thrived on control, who bent people and situations to his will. Tonight, however, that control had slipped through his fingers, leaving behind only frustration and fury. "What the hell happened?" Daryl barked, his voice sharp enough to cut through the heavy air. His piercing eyes darted between the two men standing before him. The hulking brute cradled his bandaged arm, and the wiry man nursed a swollen eye. Their usual bravado had evaporated, replaced by nervous fidgeting and uneasy silence. It was a setup, the wiry man stammered, his voice shaky as he stared at the floor. "We didn't know he'd fight back like that. The guy, he wasn't normal. He moved like he's been in a war or something." Daryl's fist came down hard on the desk, the sharp crack of wood making both men flinch. "You're telling me 6 of you couldn't handle one guy and his damn dog? What are we running here? A circus?" The hulking man shifted uncomfortably, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his boss's glare. "Boss, it wasn't just him. That dog. It was like it knew what we were going to do before we did it. And the guy, he knew how to fight. Real trained. Military, maybe." Daryl leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing into slits as he processed the information. "Military," he muttered, rolling the word on his tongue like it was a bitter taste he couldn't spit out. His expression darkened, the implications clear. "You're telling me we've got a trained killer poking his nose where it doesn't belong?" "He's dangerous, boss," the wiry man added quickly, his voice trembling. "If he comes after us, he won't get the chance," Daryl snapped, cutting him off mid-sentence. His voice dropped, cold and razor-sharp. "We don't wait for him to make the first move. We find him. We end this before it gets out of hand." The hulking man frowned, shifting uneasily. "You sure, boss? He already took us apart once." Daryl's glare froze him mid-sentence. "Do I look unsure to you?" he hissed. "Find out who he is, where he lives, everything. We send a message, not just to him, but to anyone else who thinks they can stand against us." The two men nodded reluctantly, their shoulders heavy with unease as they shuffled out of the room. The door closed with a faint creak, leaving Daryl alone in the dimly lit office. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk, and steepled his fingers under his chin, his lips twisted into a grim smile, equal parts menace and anticipation. "You're not the only one who knows how to fight," he murmured to the empty room, his voice low and dangerous. "Let's see how good you really are." Back at Hunter's home, he stood in the quiet of his kitchen, staring down at the map spread across the table. The red circles and scribbled notes seemed to burn into his mind, each one a reminder of the danger that loomed over innocent families. He folded the map carefully, tucking it into his jacket. His eyes drifted down to Shadow, who sat patiently by his side, his steady gaze a mirror of Hunter's own determination. "We'll do this right," Hunter said quietly, running a hand over Shadow's head. "No one else gets hurt." The dog's ears flicked in acknowledgement, but his sharp eyes stayed locked on Hunter, as if understanding the weight of his master's resolve. Deep down, Hunter knew the fight was inevitable. No matter how precise or restrained he tried to be, the gang wouldn't let this go. The storm was coming. The morning fog clung to the narrow highway, curling like ghostly tendrils around the trees as Hunter's truck rumbled through the quiet town. Shadow sat alert in the passenger seat, his sharp ears perked as the truck passed rows of weathered buildings. On the dashboard sat the evidence from the gang's discarded bag: the map, the burner phone, and a crumpled list of names. One name stood out: Jimmy B. The messages on the phone described Jimmy as the gang's logistics man, the one responsible for moving supplies, scouting targets, and keeping their operation running smoothly. If Hunter could take him out of the equation, it would disrupt their network and send a message that they weren't as untouchable as they believed. Hunter parked his truck a few blocks away from a dingy bar on the outskirts of town. Its faded neon sign buzzed faintly in the misty morning, casting a pale blue glow over the gravel lot. Shadow's ears twitched as Hunter adjusted his jacket. "Stay," Hunter murmured, patting the dog's head. Shadow whined softly, his tail thumping once against the seat, but he obeyed, curling up and watching Hunter intently as he exited the truck. Hunter's boots crunched on the gravel as he made his way toward the bar, his every step measured and deliberate. Inside, the bar was dimly lit, the air thick with the stale scent of beer and cigarettes. A jukebox hummed faintly in the corner, barely audible over the low murmur of conversations. In a shadowed corner booth, Hunter spotted him: Jimmy B. The wiry man nursed a half-empty bottle of beer, his greasy hair clinging to his forehead. He had the look of someone who thrived in the shadows, his confidence bolstered by the sense that no one would dare challenge him here. Hunter strode to the booth, his presence commanding. Without a word, he slid into the seat across from Jimmy, whose posture stiffened immediately. The man's narrowed eyes darted to Hunter, his expression shifting from confusion to suspicion. "Who the hell are you?" Jimmy asked, his voice sharp and defensive. Hunter leaned forward, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "The man you should have avoided," he said. "I know who you are, Jimmy, and I know what you're doing." Jimmy's hand twitched toward his jacket, but Hunter's own hand came to rest on the table, his movements slow and deliberate. His gaze didn't waver as he spoke, his tone low and firm. "You don't want to do that," Hunter warned, his voice carrying an unspoken promise. "I'm not here to waste time. You're going to tell me everything about the gang, who you report to, where you operate, and what your next move is." Jimmy scoffed, the sound forced, his unease showing in the way his eyes darted toward the door. "You got the wrong guy, pal. I don't know anything." Hunter reached into his jacket and pulled out the map he'd taken from the gang's discarded bag, slapping it onto the table. The circled addresses and scrawled notes stared up at Jimmy like accusations, and the blood drained from his face. "You recognize this, don't you?" Hunter pressed, his voice sharpening. "You're running out of lies, Jimmy." Jimmy opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the bar door swung open with a sharp creak. Two men entered, their footsteps heavy and deliberate as their eyes locked onto the booth. They were gang muscle, broad, mean-looking, and clearly there to back Jimmy up. "Hey, Jimmy!" one of them called out, his voice carrying a low growl as he approached. "You good?" Jimmy's confidence returned in an instant, his posture relaxing as he leaned back in his seat, smirking. "I'm fine," he said, the sneer in his voice unmistakable. "Just explaining to this guy that he doesn't belong here." The two men flanked the booth, their presence towering and oppressive. One cracked his knuckles, the sound loud in the quiet bar. "You heard him," the other said, his tone flat but menacing. "Time for you to go." Hunter's eyes flicked between them, his sharp gaze assessing every detail. Their stances, the tension in their hands, and the telltale bulge of a concealed weapon under one man's jacket. He exhaled slowly, his voice remaining calm but gaining an edge of steel. "I'm not going anywhere," he said evenly, "but you've got two options. Sit down and keep quiet, or make a move and regret it." The knuckle-cracker sneered, pulling a knife from his pocket and flipping it open with practiced ease. "Wrong answer," he hissed. He lunged at Hunter, the blade aimed for his chest, but Hunter moved with lightning speed. He caught the man's wrist mid-strike and twisted sharply, forcing the knife to clatter to the floor. Before the man could recover, Hunter delivered a precise elbow to his temple, dropping him to the ground in a dazed heap. The second man's hand darted for the pistol under his jacket, but Hunter was already moving. Grabbing the beer bottle from the table, he smashed it against the man's hand with a sharp crack, sending the weapon flying across the room. The man recoiled in pain, but before he could react, Hunter pressed the jagged edge of the shattered bottle to his throat. "Stay down," Hunter growled, his voice low and dangerous, before shoving the man back into a nearby table. The table tipped over, and the man crumpled against it, groaning. Jimmy bolted from the booth in the chaos, scrambling for the exit like a cornered rat. "Shadow!" Hunter barked, his voice sharp. Outside, a single loud bark echoed through the mist, followed by Jimmy's terrified scream. Shadow's growl rumbled in the air, a menacing sound that sent shivers down the spine. Hunter stepped outside to see Shadow pinning Jimmy to the ground near the bar's door, his sharp teeth bared, a low growl vibrating in his chest. The wiry man was trembling, his face pale and drenched in sweat. Behind him, the man with the knife staggered to his feet, blood trickling down the side of his face. Desperate, he grabbed a chair and swung it wildly at Hunter. Hunter ducked, evading the swing with ease, and countered with a powerful kick to the man's knee. A sickening crack followed, and the man collapsed with a howl, clutching his leg as he writhed on the ground. Inside, the remaining patrons had frozen, their drinks forgotten as they stared at the scene in stunned silence. No one moved to intervene. Hunter didn't give them a second glance as he turned his attention back to Jimmy. He crouched in front of the pinned man, his icy gaze locking onto Jimmy's panicked eyes. Shadow growled, his teeth hovering inches from Jimmy's neck. "You're going to tell me everything," Hunter said, his voice cold and unyielding. "Or the next time you meet Shadow, he won't stop at your arm." Jimmy nodded frantically, his body trembling beneath Shadow's weight. Okay, I'll talk. We've got a stash house a few miles out, off Route 12. That's where we keep the supplies, guns, money, everything. And the leader?" Hunter pressed his tone like a blade against Jimmy's fear. "Daryl Kane," Jimmy blurted, his voice cracking. "He calls the shots. But you don't want to mess with him, man. He'll kill you." Hunter's expression didn't change. He stood, hauling Jimmy to his feet with little effort. "You're going to lead me there," he said coldly, his tone leaving no room for argument. As they drove toward the stash house, Jimmy sat in the passenger seat, nervously rattling off details about the operation, his voice trembling. Hunter's eyes stayed on the road, his grip firm on the steering wheel. In the rearview mirror, Shadow's alert gaze met Hunter's briefly, the dog's steady presence grounding him. "We've got a long way to go," Hunter muttered under his breath. Shadow let out a soft bark, his tail wagging faintly, as if to say he was ready. The dirt road ahead stretched out like a vein through the dense forest, winding its way deeper into isolation. Hunter's truck moved steadily along the uneven terrain, the sound of crunching gravel, the only accompaniment to Jimmy's nervous chatter. The burner phone and map sat on the dashboard, their incriminating contents etched into Hunter's memory. Shadow remained alert in the back seat, his ears twitching at the faint rustle of leaves outside. "How much farther to the stash house?" Hunter asked, his voice calm, but with an undercurrent of steel. Jimmy hesitated, licking his lips as his gaze darted around. "Just a couple more miles. There's a turnoff up ahead," he replied, his words hurried. Hunter nodded, but the knot of unease in his chest tightened. Jimmy's fidgeting wasn't just fear. It was something else, expectation. Shadow growled softly, pressing his nose against the window, his body tensing. "What is it, boy?" Hunter muttered, his eyes scanning the road and the trees lining its edge. Then he saw it. A faint flicker of light through the foliage. A reflection. The telltale glint of a sniper's scope. Hunter's jaw clenched. Without hesitation, he slammed the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt on the gravel road. "Down!" he barked to Shadow as he threw the vehicle into reverse. The dog ducked immediately, and in the same moment, gunfire erupted. A loud crack shattered the air, followed by the splintering sound of the windshield exploding inward. Shards of glass sprayed across the cab, glittering in the dim light. Jimmy screamed, his hands flying over his head as he ducked low in the seat. "They're here! They're here!" he yelled, his voice panicked and shrill. Hunter didn't flinch. His eyes stayed sharp, scanning for cover as he maneuvered the truck in reverse, the roar of gunfire and Shadow's low growl filling the cabin. This wasn't just a setup. It was an ambush. Hunter backed the truck into the cover of a small embankment, throwing it into park with a decisive yank. "Stay in the truck," he ordered sharply, his tone brooking no argument. He reached behind the seat and grabbed his rifle. Shadow whined softly, but obeyed, crouching low in the back seat, his sharp eyes fixed on Hunter as if waiting for further instructions. Hunter exited the vehicle low and fast, keeping his profile minimized as gunfire erupted around him. The attackers were using suppressing fire, trying to keep him pinned down. Through the chaos, his trained eye quickly picked out their positions. 3 shooters spread out in the tree line ahead, one perched on the ridge to his left, and another circling wide on foot. "They've boxed us in," Hunter muttered under his breath, sliding the bolt of his rifle into place. Years of sniper training took over, his breathing slowing as he focused. The noise, the chaos, even the pounding of his own heart faded into the background. Using the truck as cover, he scanned the ridge where he'd seen the glint earlier. Through his scope, he spotted the sniper lying prone, his rifle trained on the truck. Hunter exhaled slowly, his world narrowing to the crosshairs. With a single sharp crack, he fired. The sniper's body jerked, his rifle slipping from his hands before he went still. The attackers faltered, rattled by the sudden precision. "He's got a rifle!" one of them shouted, their voices tense and muffled by the cover of the trees. Hunter didn't wait for them to regroup. Staying low, he moved along the embankment, circling to gain a better vantage point. He climbed a slight incline, which gave him a clearer view of the tree line. Through his scope, he spotted another shooter leaning out from behind a tree. The man fired a few erratic shots toward the truck, oblivious to Hunter's new position. Hunter exhaled again,